Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Chitheads. My guest today is David Loy. David is a professor of Buddhist and comparative philosophy and a teacher in the Sanbo. Actually, am I pronouncing that correctly?
Sanbo.
Sanbo Zen. Okay, I'm going to do that again.
Sure.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Chitheads. My guest today is David Loy. David is a professor of Buddhist and comparative philosophy and a teacher in the Sanbo Zen tradition of Japanese Buddhism. His books include Non-Duality, a study in comparative philosophy, Lack and Transcendence, the problem of death and life in psychotherapy, Existentialism and Buddhism, and Ecodharma, Buddhist teachings for the ecological crisis, which is forthcoming this next year in 2019. He is especially concerned about social and ecological issues. In addition to offering academic lectures, workshops, and meditation retreats, he is one of the founders of the new Rocky Mountain Ecodharma Retreat Center near Boulder, Colorado. In June 2014, David received an honorary degree from Carleton College, his alma mater, during its 2014 commencement. In April 2016, David returned his honorary degree to protest the decision of the Board of Trustees not to divest from fossil fuel investments. So hello, David. Thank you so much for joining me.
Well, thank you for this invitation. Very happy to be with you.
Absolutely. So I'm actually very honored to interview you. I was telling you before we started recording that, I'm a big fan of your work and have been following it for some time, from my first reading of Non-Duality, which was certainly a game changer and very clarifying of a concept that I feel like is often thrown around with a lot of confusion. So I'm looking forward to talking, clearly about that concept today.
As clearly as it can be talked about.
As clearly as it can be talked about, something that transcends words. But before we get into that, the end of your bio ends in a kind of, radical statement about something that you, the returning of your honorary degree. So because that, form of activism really reflects, I think, some of your current commitments, I would love to kind of start with that. So can you tell us a little about, what happened there and how do you return an honorary degree?
It's a good question. Well, to my surprise, Carleton about 3 years ago sent me this letter just offering this honorary degree and asking me to speak at the commencement ceremony in June 2016, as you said. And that was a lot of fun, actually. But also, I've been part of a group of students, alumni, faculty, and staff that have been pushing the Board of Trustees of Carleton to divest from fossil fuel investments. Carleton, like many colleges, has a fairly large endowment, and not a very large amount, but nonetheless a significant amount is invested in a couple fossil fuel corporations. Curiously, two of the ones that are very active here in Colorado and which have a very bad reputation. So I've been part of that group trying to dialogue with the Board of Trustees, and they haven't been very responsive. So one idea was to publicly return the degree and see if that would contribute to the pressure. And we're still doing it. So far, the board is sort of holding fast on that issue. But I mean, it seems a really important one to me, not in terms of the amount of money that's actually invested, but symbolically, should a college be profiting from fossil fuel companies that, for the most part, are doing the best they can to resist the kind of shift into renewable sources of energy that we so desperately need today?
Yeah. Well, it's a very admirable, form of activism there, and it aligns, I think, quite nicely with, the principle of Ecodharma that you are talking about in your next book. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about Ecodharma and how kind of Buddhist teachings can give us insight into the ecological crisis.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a really good question, because needless to say, at the time that Buddhism first originated, about 2,400 years ago in Iron Age India, there wasn't an ecological crisis. I mean, they had their own political problems and such, but and likewise, as Buddhism spread throughout Asia, that really wasn't something that had ever sort of confronted. So we
Yeah.
can't go back to the original texts and sort of read off any specific answers. However, you can extrapolate certain things from Buddhist teachings. For example, I see important parallels between what Buddhism traditionally has to say about our individual predicament, our sense of separation. I mean, one way to understand the fundamental problem is this sense of duality,
Mm-hmm.
that we feel there's a sense of self inside that's quite separate from the rest of the world outside. And Buddhism, I think, addresses that traditionally on the individual or personal level. But I think now we have a comparable sort of species-wide issue. I mean, I think it's the same sense of separation between our species as a whole, or contemporary civilization, if you will, and the rest of the biosphere. So one thing one can see if you sort of spend some time looking at it is there do seem to be some fascinating parallels in that. The other thing that I think is important in terms of the Buddhist response is that we have this idea of the bodhisattva path.
Yeah.
So that Buddhism isn't simply about, your own peace of mind or your own awakening, but
Right.
that as we begin to see through this delusion of separation, we have a stronger sense of responsibility and compassion, wanting to help other people as well. And so I think in that sense, given the particular problem we have today, I think the bodhisattva path needs to expand to understand, to respond to that kind of situation as well.
Right. How do Buddhist teachings offer us something different so obviously we have a lot of ecologically minded people operating from within a kind of, embedded in a Western response, whatever that means. Right. So what does what does Buddhism lend us in terms of this crisis that might be, helpful, where other principles, from a kind of Western context would not be so helpful?
Mm-hmm. Well, I wonder if the most important thing that Buddhism has to offer is this concept of the bodhisattva path, because the bodhisattva has a double path, or maybe we should say a two-sided path, in that they continue to be concerned about their own contemplative practice, their own personal spiritual development. At the same time, they know that that's insufficient, and that it's not enough just to kind of rest or dwell in your own equanimity or your own emptiness, as Buddhism talks about, but that it's important to go out there and be engaged in the world. And I think when you look at the enormous challenges that we face today, and how difficult it is to avoid being burned out, so often activism is frustrated in one way or the other. I think it's really important, when possible, to sort of ground that into some kind of contemplative practice that gives us some, what can I say, some sense of spaciousness about the process. And in particular, right, one of the really important things that the Bodhisattva path emphasizes is acting without attachment to the results of action.
Right.
It's easy to misunderstand. I think a lot of people would maybe misunderstand that as sort of taking away from the urgency of what we do. And I don't think that's what's pointed to. Rather, what it means is something like, it's our task to do the very best we can, not knowing if anything we do makes any difference whatsoever.
Yeah.
And the ability to do that, I think, is very difficult unless one is grounded in some kind of spiritual practice.
So your life has been, a pretty beautiful illustration of the intersection of scholarship and practice. And so I'm just curious, because personally, I like to hear academics who are also practitioners talk about this, sometimes struggle. So has it been a struggle for you ever, reconciling the demands of scholarship with the life of a practitioner?
Not so much, I think, although I kind of evolved into it in a rather unusual way. I mean, after I graduated from Carleton back in '69, I basically dropped out. I didn't have any interest in graduate school. I went out to San Francisco, and I was part of the draft resistance movement there.
I see.
In fact, I expected to spend a couple of years in prison, but just before I would have been drafted, they came in with a lottery system, and my number was too low. So actually. And then I realized that I sort of needed to work on myself. So I kind of dropped out and I started a round the world trip. And the first stop was Hawaii, and I got stuck there because I didn't have any money. So I ended up in Hawaii for 5 years. And that was kind of a romantic adventure, living in a remote valley. Didn't have two dimes to rub together, but living mostly off the land there. And then from there, I eventually got involved in Zen practice. And it was Robert Aiken, a Zen teacher, who eventually suggested that I might like to go back to graduate school. I think he thought I might be a translator. He didn't know how bad I was at languages. So I immediately zoomed back into Asian philosophy and comparative philosophy because I was trying to understand the kind of changes or things that I'd been experiencing in my practice. And sort of one thing led to another. Yeah. Later on, I eventually ended up in Singapore visiting my parents and ended up getting a job there and teaching in the philosophy department there, just with a master's degree from Hawaii.
Oh, wow.
But at that time, I wanted to write, I knew I wanted to write a book on non-duality. And I'd already written several essays or papers on it. And the University of Singapore is a British system. So basically what they need is just a really big, thick book, something like the non-duality book. And that's basically what happened. So that ended up in a very kind of unexpected way, opening the doors for some academic positions. But because I started from the practice standpoint and I really wasn't connected with any particular movement or graduate school in the West, I've sort of basically gone my own way from the beginning.
Right. And you also were at a school, University of Hawaii, that is very, it's a very famous school for comparative philosophy between the East and West. So it's sort of like a happy place for you to do that kind of work, right?
Well, I don't know that I would have done it anywhere else. It just,
right.
just so happened that that was the place I could go. And because I was living there, I sort of qualified for in-state tuition, which is the only reason I could afford to go too.
So. Oh, nice. Score. Well, one thing I love about the book is that, a lot of, I feel like I see a lot of comparative philosophy between East and West that's really trying to, it's sort of reading the East in the terms of the West. So it's like trying to see what the Eastern traditions have to say about, our epistemological problems, right? That really are problems of the Western tradition. Where what I love about non-duality is that it seems like it's doing the opposite. It's sort of reading the Western tradition from the commitments of the Eastern contemplative experience, which felt, very refreshing for me reading it, especially since I studied Western philosophy myself. So, there's so much, just to get into this topic of non-duality, it's become a very hip, concept, a very hip idea. And I feel like a lot of the times, it's sort of just thrown around willy-nilly with kind of confused connotation. People talking about, living, I'm just living non-dually, or I'm a part of this non-dual community. And so it's almost like where someone's identifying with their non-dual experience, which it seems like if a non-duality is a mode of identification, then they've missed the point. Right? So what have you encountered as sort of misunderstandings in your own, teaching of this notion of non-duality?
Well, the first thing to say is that the concept is inherently ambiguous, right?
Right.
Non-duality literally meaning not two, but whenever you hear the concept, you have to ask, well, what is the two that's being denied?
Yeah.
And there's many different dualities that can be looked at in a non-dual way. So for example, the non-duality of bipolar concepts like big, small, good versus evil. In Buddhism, there's particular non-dualities such as samsara nirvana. If you read the Buddhist, the Mahayana philosopher Nagarjuna, he's denying the kind of separation that seems to be built into Theravada or early Buddhism, where, this world is the world of suffering and nirvana is, as it were, some other dimension or realm, and we're trying to transcend or escape this world in order to go there. And so Nagarjuna makes it very clear from the beginning that what we're talking about is really different ways of experiencing this world here and now. Um, and also, just keeping to Buddhism for the moment, the duality of practice and enlightenment that you find very strongly in Dogen. But I suppose the one that's of most interest to me, and the one that takes up most of the attention in the non-duality book, is the non-duality of self and other, or subject and object, right? So emphasizing the non-duality is denying that the sense of separation that we normally feel, that there's a me inside and the rest of the world is outside me. That, I mean, in contemporary terms, what that's basically implying, what we could say is that the sense of self is a psychological and social construct, the sense of separation. And a spiritual path like Buddhism, for example, shows us how that might be deconstructed and reconstructed.
Yeah. Yeah. So, in the book, towards the beginning, you unpack 5 different dualities, which I thought, when I was reading it, I was like, oh, it's so clarifying to see it sort of drawn out in this way. And you're talking a little bit about it already. You're distinguishing between different kinds of non-duality. But I would love for the listeners just to kind of go point by point between these 5 of them, that at least the 5 that I noticed. Maybe I missed
some. You might have to remind me, Jacob.
Oh, I will, promise. So the five types of non-duality. Yes, this was your dissertation, was it?
Originally, that's right.
Yes. So it's been a while, everybody. But the first one is the negation of dualistic thinking.
Right.
So I guess we'll just go point by point, and if you could just kind of give us a brief sort of summary of each one.
Sure. Well, this is a pretty straightforward one. I mean, for example, big, small. Seems like we have 2 different concepts there, but if you think about it, actually they're very much interdependent, in the sense that if you don't understand the concept of little, you don't understand the concept of big, right? Yeah. It's really like they're 2 sides of the same coin, the same concept, which means that you can't have one without the other, because each is the negation of the other, right? So what is big? Well, it means it's not little. What's little? It means it's not big. And the important point here is that this is not just a logical point, but it can be very psychologically important as well. For example, if the most important thing for you is to live a pure life, what that implies is you're going to be preoccupied with impurity. I mean, however you understand pure and impure, they are a dualistic pair. Purity means not impure, and vice versa. So to live a pure life, it means that you would end up being preoccupied with distinguishing situations and choices. You have to pick one or the other. You can't have one. You can't have the concept pure without the concept impure.
Right.
And this may be why one of the great Chan masters, Hui Hai, made the point that true purity is to live beyond the duality of purity and impurity. Beautiful. And maybe even a better example, or maybe the best example, if you would, is good versus evil, right. and how easily we get caught up in that. Once we could say that in order to feel good about ourselves, we have to find something that's evil, and if we want to feel really good, we like to be fighting against that evil. And I think this points to one of the sort of tragic paradoxes of a lot of history, that one of the main causes or sources of evil in the world has been our attempts to destroy evil.
Yeah.
If you think about heresy and witchcraft trials, and even somebody like Hitler, or he's trying to purify the earth, as it were, by getting rid of the polluting or the evil elements, and how often we tend to fall into that. I think the war on terror is another classic example of that. What was the difference between George W. Bush and Osama bin Laden? I think they were both fighting this holy war of good against evil. Of course, they reversed the valency. What the one thought was good, the other thought was evil. But nonetheless, once you've identified something as evil, your job is to destroy it, not to understand it, not to negotiate with it. And it's a pretty problematical one, I think.
So my follow-up question to that then, because I think this often leads to a kind of interesting question, which is, if we are to transcend that because of course everyone is probably resonating with what you're saying in terms of, these ways in which good and evil as a morality gets deployed in terrible campaigns. But how does acting out against injustice or acting out against ecological, forms of devastation, does it require a concept of good and evil in order to function, in order to inspire us to be, on the side of, what we consider to be good, for lack of a better term?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I hope not, and I think not. I mean, if you go back to Buddhist teachings, the Buddha doesn't talk in terms of good and evil. It's wholesome, unwholesome, or sometimes skillful and unskillful, right?
I see.
So, I mean, for Buddhism, the fundamental duality isn't the good versus evil that you find in the Abrahamic traditions, but much more delusion versus wisdom,
Right.
So, and again, that would bring us back to this other type of duality, that the delusion would be seeing dualities and also seeing sense of separation and our tribe against their tribe, whereas the more skillful or the more wholesome would be to realize the interdependence and the non-separation between them.
I see. Okay, so then the second type of duality is the non-plurality of the world.
Right. Okay, well,
Can we talk a little about that?
Well, this gets into some pretty subtle kind of Buddhist metaphysics, because, I mean, that kind of non-plurality, you find that in Mahayana Buddhism. You don't really find it very much in the Pali Canon or in, say, Theravada in early Buddhism. And this is where I think that Buddhism here can be fruitfully compared, as I try to do in the book, with the kind of thing that Vedanta, especially Advaita Vedanta, is talking about. For Advaita, I mean, everything is ultimately Brahman, sort of one consciousness. And insofar as we experience the world as a collection of separate things, that's we're deluded. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting how language can be understood to play a role there, because learning to speak is learning to see the world as a collection of sort of utensils, as Heidegger might say, collection of utensils that can be used in various ways to satisfy our desires. So the point of this non-duality is to say that through some kind of practice, through some kind of meditation, we can sort of temporarily let go of this labeling and discriminating process and sort of experience the world as some sort of, how to say it? I mean, in Buddhism, something that can't be described, something that can't be objectified, sometimes called emptiness, but that sort of manifesting or taking form as all the things that we experience, including ourselves.
Right.
How much that helps, I don't know.
So the third one, and of course these all sort of proceed from each other, the non-difference of subject and object.
Right. And that's the, as I said before, that's the main one that the book is addressing. And one thing I found especially interesting here was the kind of, how to say it, the mirror image between what Buddhism is saying and what Advaita Vedanta is saying. That, for example, when it comes to the self, Buddhism famously says that there's no self. Right. And Brahman is literally, the claim of Brahman and Advaita is that everything is the self. And what's fascinating about that is they really, I mean, as Wittgenstein put it, right? Actually, I'm not quite sure how he expressed it, but the realization that whether or not you shrink to nothing or expand to incorporate everything, it amounts to the same thing, that you've managed to overcome this duality of inside and outside, of self and other. So the claim here is that one of the essential aspects of the kind of awakening that Buddhism, for example, is talking about is one where, in Buddhist terms, the sense of self sort of lets go, forgets itself, as Dogen would say. We forget ourselves, we let go of ourselves, and in the process, we let go of this sense that there's a me inside, behind the eyes, inside the ears, that's looking out at the world. Rather, there's much more of a sense that the realization that I'm a sort of impermanent manifestation of something that's also taking form in all the other people and all the other things in the world, but that not separate from that.
Yeah. Yeah, so this is actually something I wanted to ask you about, because I think that that's one of the most compelling parts of the book, is when you describe the ways in which the self, or the Atman of Advaita Vedanta, versus the Anatman of Mahayana Buddhism are essentially referring to the same experience. And so, you know, because there is often a kind of philosophical battle between these two sides, no, it's the self, no, it's the not self. I'm just curious if you have any insights into the historical reasons for why this difference. I mean, I understand that sort of one side focuses on the subject, one side focuses on the object, and then, you know, transmutes that into the mystical experience, if you will. But why these two different traditions? Why not? Why don't they ultimately, if they are ultimately pointing to the same experience, why don't they end up, you know, talking about it in similar ways?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, well, I think it has a lot to do with the way that language works.
Mm.
That it tends to reinforce this sense of separation.
Yeah.
What I find is quite striking is that basically these two systems tended to develop at the same time, right? Vedanta and especially, as we now say, the Advaita, Vedanta and the Buddhism. So it's not as though, as people often think, that Buddhism was a kind of heretical offshoot of Vedanta. They were actually springing up more or less parallel to each other. But why it is that the one, I mean, if you have the duality, there's two ways to go, and I guess I'm not surprised that both of those are going to be explored. I mean, one thing I notice is a sense of preoccupation with boundaries on both sides. It's interesting that Advaita Vedantins are really very concerned to distinguish themselves from Buddhists, and vice versa. But once you actually look at what they seem to be pointing at, if you can sort of get beyond some of the metaphysical structuring, it really does seem to be very similar. And I think we tend to miss that because we get caught up in the conceptualization, precisely what the spiritual path is supposed to help us let go of, you know?
Exactly, yeah.
Like when we're meditating. That's not a very good answer to your question. I guess the real answer is I don't know, but I guess I'm not surprised that both of those would have been explored. Yeah.
No, I think that's a great answer. So the next one's a fun one. The non-duality of duality and non-duality. My favorite one.
Yeah, yeah. Well, so through, for example, the Buddhist path, for example, Zen, a lot of meditation and so forth. As I said a minute ago, you know, we can let go of ourselves and forget ourselves and have this experience of non-separation. But at the same time, that's not to deny the other side of it as well. I mean, one doesn't live in that world. It's like,
right.
Or one doesn't live only in that world, right? It's like, I can feel that I'm part of everything, that I'm manifesting through everything, that I am myself a manifestation of everything. But nonetheless, there comes a point where, you know, David Loy has to get a driver's license, and I need a bank account, and, you know, David is separate from Jacob. So that side of things is not completely denied, nor is it the point. I mean, and I think this is an important one, that sometimes people think the point of Buddhism is to simply realize the non-dual and simply dwell there.
Yeah.
But the way that I would put it, what's more important is to be able to live in both worlds, to be comfortable in both worlds, to see them as two sides of the same coin, and be able to move back and forth from one to the other, and ultimately, you know, sort of integrate them.
Yeah.
Um, I don't know if you're familiar with the first chapter of the Tao Te Ching, but I think that's basically what's going on there. It's a very paradoxical, very strange chapter to figure out, but basically lines 1, 3, 5, and 7 are talking about the non-dual way of experiencing, which is the Tao in Chinese terms. And then 2, 4, 6, 8, they're talking about the what we might call the phenomenal world, the the world as we normally experience it. And it's quite fascinating the way that that chapter also understands the relationship between the two, because when we have desires, when we have intentions, when we conceptualize, then of course we're living in the dualistic or the phenomenal world. But when we're able to let go of that, then we have a glimpse or a taste of this more non-dual dimension.
Yeah, I think the Tao Te... Sorry, go ahead.
No, does that make any sense?
Yes, totally. I love that you mentioned the Tao Te Ching, because I think the Tao Te Ching, for me, reflects the non-dual more than more argumentative texts, because it's sort of paradoxical in nature. And when you start to talk about the non-dual in dualistic terms, there's something paradoxical about that. And I just feel like the spirit of the text seems to, reflect or mirror the non-dual, as much as that's possible, more than, traditional kind of philosophical arguments about what the non-dual is.
I would agree with that. I mean, and I think it's a very poetic text. Somebody else who comes to mind there too is Dogen,
Yeah.
in Japanese. But it's interesting, East Asia, because I think it had some of its own non-dual traditions that resonated very nicely. So when Mahayana Buddhism came to China, for example, and then spread to Korea, Japan, and so forth, there was, as it were, a kind of context. And really, Chan or Zen was the result of sort of the interaction between Mahayana and Chan, Mahayana and Taoism. In fact, I think it's sometimes said that if Mahayana Buddhism is the father of Zen, then Taoism is the mother. And
Yeah.
I think that's really true.
Yeah. So now I wanted to ask about the, oh, well, actually, let's get to our fifth one first. Sorry, I don't want to leave everybody hanging. So the fifth one is maybe the one that, most people think about the non-dual experience, or one of the ways they think about it, which is the possibility of mystical unity between God and man. So, it's pretty self-explanatory, but do you want to say a few words about that?
Well, that question raises, one of the really interesting issues is, how do we understand the relationship between the kind of ultimate spiritual reality for the Abrahamic religions that have been so important in the evolution of the West, right?
Yeah.
Western civilization, thinking of Judaism, Christianity, Islam, where for them the ultimate is God.
Yeah.
That is to say, a personal absolute. And then if you compare that to what I call the non-dualist traditions of Vedanta, Taoism, and Buddhism, which seem to be talking about something much more impersonal. I mean, one striking thing is that for some mystics in particular, I'm thinking especially of somebody like Meister Eckhart, or the anonymous author of The Cloud of Unknowing, there's very much the sense that well, first of all, not only are there so many similarities in terms of the practice, which is very suggestive that maybe the result is maybe not that different. Maybe it's simply a different way of talking. But one thing very clear in somebody like Eckhart, he distinguishes between Deus and Deitas, or God and the Godhead, and the idea that ultimately to let go of ourselves and completely become one with God is to transcend God, is to realize what he calls the Godhead. And he often seems to describe it in ways that resonate with the way that Buddhism would talk about emptiness, for example. Mm-hmm. It's very interesting. My main teacher in Kamakura, Japan, where I lived for about 20 years, Yamada Koen, he was very well known for being open to Christians. He had a lot of Christian students, mostly from Europe and the Philippines, who were there because they wanted to revive the contemplative tradition within their own faith traditions. And it was very interesting the way that some of those people understood their experience in more theistic terms, that they thought that what we call emptiness is maybe not so different from what some of the traditions have called God. Now, this is a big issue. It's on both sides. It's very theologically subtle, but for the moment, I guess that's all I can say.
Yeah, no, I think it's, it's great to mention that. And I think it is, it's sort of, even within the Eastern traditions, obviously you have, the Vaishnavas who put the personality of God on the top, and then, the Vedantins that put the impersonality of God on the top. And it's like, at the end of the day, it's about the experience, not the concept, I suppose.
And also Buddhism, Pure Land, has, I mean, one thing I do talk about in the non-duality book is the difference between a path that emphasizes contemplation or meditation or letting go, which seems tied to some sort of impersonal experience,
right,
versus the more devotional path. It's like, if it's going to be devotional, if it's going to have kind of purifying the emotions, emphasizing love, where love seems to require that which is loved.
yeah.
And so I can get a sense of how somebody following that path might understand that which is loved as something like a God.
Yeah, it seems to me, the difference seems to come down to kind of the type of personality following the path. Some people are drawn to that devotional, and some people are drawn to the impersonal in one way or another. So you mentioned in your book, there's this great chapter about causality, and I'm not going to try to re-articulate the argument, and maybe that'd even be challenging for you at this point. But basically, you come down to the essence of the argument is that causality itself is also shunya, or empty. And so my question when I was reading that then is, then what is karma? From the perspective of causality being empty itself, because I guess karma obviously is fraught with disagreement. It's about what it means, and it's a very controversial topic. Especially when it's reduced to seemingly victim blaming, that it's like it sometimes is. But so I'm curious, just because you've done so much work thinking about this, I'd love to hear sort of what karma is from your perspective based on that insight.
Right. Well, it's and it's also important from the perspective of social justice, right?
Yeah.
I once heard a Tibetan teacher say, "Oh, what terrible karma all those Jews must have had in Nazi."
Right.
That's just really unacceptable. And also the caste system in India, of course, is based on a kind of karmic system. This is one of those issues where it's hard to know how literally to take the original teachings. And of course, there's always some difficulty. I mean, in the Pali Canon, as in other old spiritual traditions, it's hard to know what might have been added later, what's been left out, what other things are going on. But I think for us today, or at least for me personally, I should say, I think it's important to put questions of sort of cosmological karma, the kind of karma that might cause rebirth, and rebirth itself, to kind of put those on a shelf. Not denying them, not denying that possibility, but simply saying, I don't know, which I don't. Personally, I don't have any memory of my own past lifetimes, if any. But what's interesting about karma is, I think there's a kind of naturalistic understanding that's very powerful, and that can explain a lot of it. Emphasizing that at the time of the Buddha, most people believed in something like karma, but they tended to understand it in kind of a mechanical way. If you sacrifice in the right way, you'll get what you sacrifice for. And what the Buddha emphasized, and this was a really important part of his sort of spiritual revolution, was motivation, intention. It's not just what we do, but it's the motivation behind it. And I think what he's really pointing to is something very important that's often lost, because even the word karma literally means action. It doesn't mean the result or the fruit of action, which is the way that we're often talking about it. It's really basically what I think it's saying is something like this, that there's a simple, if not necessarily easy way to transform how it is that we actually experience each other, how we experience the world, how other people experience and respond to me. And the fundamental issue there is transforming our motivations. Karma emphasizes you sort of, because of what happens, you're going to sort of experience the world's going to treat you in a different way. I think we can get a handle on that just in terms of our own motivations, right?
Yeah.
If we're motivated by what Buddhism calls the three poisons, greed, ill will, delusion, then we're going to experience the world and ourselves very differently than if we're motivated by the opposites: generosity, loving kindness, the wisdom that recognizes and embodies our non-separation, right? I mean, a pickpocket's going to look in a room of people, and he's going to see people's pockets, right? I mean, a Buddha is going to see the Buddha nature of everybody, if you want to kind of simplistic. So, I mean, I think what karma is pointing to is not something that has to be understood in a kind of a supernatural way. Not that I mean to deny that possibility, but rather simply that how important it is transforming our motivations. And then what was it? In other words, we're punished not for our sins, but by them. We become the kind of person who does that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And then the other side of that is that great last line in Swedenborg, Spinoza's Ethics.
Yes, I love Spinoza's Ethics.
The last verse or the last proposition, part
Remind
5.
me.
Right. Happiness is not the reward for virtue. Happiness is virtue itself. And I think that's exactly right. A person who is motivated in a certain kind of way is going to be relating to people in a certain kind of way. And of course, it doesn't always mean that that's going to come back to us, but for the most part, we're going to dwell in a certain kind of world. And I think that's, we were talking, or I think you mentioned a bit earlier about the idea of deconstruction. The deconstruction is sort of what happens when we're meditating, this constructed sense of self, composed of mostly habitual ways of thinking and feeling and acting and reacting and so forth. We're in the meditation, we're sort of letting them go. We're not acting. We're not reinforcing that cluster, as it were. But the reconstruction is in daily life transforming our motivations. So, and if you think about it, maybe the most important aspects of the sense of self that have the greatest impact in how we actually relate to other people are our motivations and the way those the way that those are expressed in our intentions. So, I mean, Buddhism really emphasizes that a great deal, and I think they're really onto something.
Yeah.
People can actually live in different worlds or experience the world very differently according to your fundamental motivations.
Yeah. So I want to shift gears a little bit now and talk about your work on lack, and the book you wrote on the approach to the Western Western history from a lack perspective. So first of all, what is lack, and and what is what do we gain by interpreting history of the West from a lack perspective?
Okay, two big questions. Yeah. I mean, to start off with, following up with what we were just saying about the delusion of separation, the delusion of inside separate from outside, the delusion that the self is separate from the external world. If that is a delusion, or in contemporary terms, if that's a psychological and social construct, then I think this has some really important implications for how we understand what Buddhism calls dukkha, right? Dukkha is the word usually translated into English as suffering. And, that's what the Buddha emphasizes, right? But there's different types of dukkha. There's the dukkha of physical and mental pain. There's the dukkha of impermanence, the fact that everything passes away, not only our friends and family, but ourselves, But I think there's also a very deep, and maybe the most problematical dukkha of all, is connected with this delusion of separation. Because what that really means, if the sense of self is a construct, something that, you know, is kind of laboriously constructed in the first few years as babies learn the language and so forth. If it's a construct, then that means there's nothing real there. There's nothing substantial. There's nothing ontological, right? And yet we feel that there's such a, it's like we're socialized to think that there is, right?
Mm-hmm.
David must correspond to something, just the way that the word cup corresponds to this, right? And so what I think that really points to is the fact that the sense of self is inherently insecure, inherently uncomfortable. It's insecure because there's nothing there that could be secured.
Yeah.
And I think the way that we normally experience that insecurity is as a sense of lack, as the sense that there's something wrong with me, there's something missing, there's something that's not quite right, or very common, I'm not good enough, right?
Yes.
Low self-esteem, that sort of thing. In other words, I think that this constructed sense of self is shadowed or even haunted, we could say, by a sense of lack, which, however, we have, and I think it's one of the great secrets of life, because it's we think it's our own problem. We don't realize everyone else has this sense of lack too. It's interesting when I go around and I talk about this, and everyone nods, just like you're nodding, because we all have this sense of lack, right?
Mm-hmm.
It really connects. But how do we understand it? Well, then I think social conditioning kicks in, and what it usually means is there's something out here. You know, I mean, 1,000 years ago in medieval Europe, you had a Catholic Church that would explain it, right? You've sinned.
Yeah.
You also inherit the original sin of Adam and Eve and so forth. But if you do what we say, after you die, you'll go to heaven and your sense of lack. Okay, now a lot of us don't accept that way of understanding anymore, but we still have a sense of lack. And I think that what happens is we tend to understand at a lack of something out here. In our culture, America, growing up, 21st century America, well, what? We don't have enough money, right?
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter how much you've got, it's not enough, because that way of understanding our sense of lack is just a symptom.
Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't matter. It's like you can never get enough money to fill up the sense of lack, when that's not really what the fundamental problem is. Same thing with fame or reputation or romantic love, looking for that perfect person that's going to complete us. I mean, these are what I sometimes call lack projects, which are, they're all tragic, because if they are how you are trying to make yourself fill up the sense of lack or feel more real, that they can never be successful. They can never, you know, give you enough of what you're looking for. And yet I think that's where many people are stuck. I think many people, you know, they exhaust their whole lives trying to, in one of these sort of sublimated and objectified ways, trying to get enough money or something to that so that they feel more real. And of course, drug addiction, I think different types of addictive behavior would be other important examples there.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think one interesting thing about this, of course, is that it also helps connect us with society. You were already referring to history, but for example, if you look at consumerism, I mean, sense of lack isn't just an individual problem, is it? It's something that our economic system feeds on.
It drives the whole machine. Yeah.
Exactly. It with advertising to capture our attention and to persuade us that it's the next thing we buy, it's going to make us happy, which it may for a few seconds or a few minutes, or depending on the purchase, a few days, you know. But the point is, none of that can really work, and yet we've ended up creating an economic system that's dependent on that, because if capitalism doesn't grow, it tends to collapse. So one of the interesting things for me is the way this understanding of lack sort of connects with social and political situations as well.
Yeah. So, you know, then I guess the question is, what is the what do we gain by looking at, the history of the West from a lack perspective? Is it a purely therapeutic one where we sort of recognize the pervasiveness and that we're not alone in this experience of lack? Or is there a kind of more optimistic thing to be found? Because someone could read it and say, oh well, it's a pessimistic view. I mean, realistic, but also pessimistic, that that lack is intrinsic to our very self. So I guess, yeah. So I think I've asked two questions there, but what do we gain?
Well, I mean, we've talked about the problem. When we don't understand the source of the sense of lack, right?
Right.
But remember, the sense of lack is the other side, as it were, of the sense of separate self. And this is where something like Buddhism comes in. It doesn't have to be Buddhism, but that's a good example of the spiritual contemplative path, right? So, yeah. I mean, I think something like meditation can, insofar as it can help us forget, let go, see through the sense of separation, because sense of lack is the other side of the sense of separation, the ego. I'm not saying that very well, am I? but since if sense of lack is the other side of sense of self, and if the meditation practice is what helps us let go of the sense of self, then it also helps to let go of sense of lack as well. And
right.
And I mean, that's what I find fascinating about. Now one can still ask the question, does something like awakening, do we want to absolutize it in the sense that genuine awakening, deepest awakening, is all sense of lack disappears? Or do we understand awakening as something that's never fully complete, but that it gives us more and more spaciousness? There's more and more awareness of our sense of lack in a way that enables us not to identify with it in the same way. So, yeah. I think most of us, maybe all of us, still have some sense of lack, but there's very different ways of understanding and relating to it. And it's obviously a lot more bothersome for some people than others. I guess I'm thinking of a rather notorious example of, recently. I'm thinking of a man who's very, very wealthy and very, very powerful, maybe the most powerful person in the world, and yet he obviously is not very happy. He's obviously somebody who has a very strong sense of lack, that his fame and power and money have not been able to really help him with.
Yeah. So, one of the things we've already talked a little bit about, obviously, capitalism, money as something that is obviously feeding off of this lack. But I thought it was really interesting the way you describe money in the book, which you describe it as sort of the placeholder or the stand-in for the sacred in our culture, which I love because it kind of dovetails nicely with something that I often talk about, which is this idea that the secular has never really been secular. It's just that, our conception of the divine, the function of the divine, has shifted. So can you talk a little bit about that, about the money as kind of the sacred placeholder? I know you've said a little bit about it already, but just in terms of the kind of divine or the secular.
Well, one way to say it is that the sacred is whatever can fill up our sense of lack. Right. Yeah. So traditionally, I mean, I do wonder, thinking historically, humanity, the human species, we're the only ones that have religion or seem to need it. And I'm wondering, from what I've said, sense of lack seems to be a function of our sort of self-consciousness, a certain kind of self-consciousness. And can we understand religion as sort of our collective social way of trying to cope with the sense of lack, right? Yeah. Whether we have gods or, we have gods that we worship, or rituals, sacrifices, and so forth, whereby we're trying to address it. And insofar as in our quote unquote secular world, we no longer believe in that, we're going to have to sacralize something else in order to fill up our sense of lack. Yeah. You reminded me of, I guess it's Wendell Berry, the poet, in one of his great poems called How to Be a Poet. He says something like, "There are no unsacred places. there are only sacred places and desecrated places.
Mm.
So a sense of the sacrality of the world. I mean, I think that that's part of what we open up to when we're able to let go of the things that we try to cling to fill up our sense of lack. We can get a sense of not only a kind of mysteriousness of the world, but a kind of sacrality as well, which
Yeah.
I think we've lost, given that again, it goes back to this parallel of our collective sense of separation, that for us, because we do feel separate from the rest of the earth, and I think it's largely a legacy not only of Judeo-Christian but Greek, going back to the Greeks, their distinction between, phusis and nomos, between the natural world and human convention. Because of this sense of separation, then I think we're doing the same thing collectively. I think our collective lack project is this attempt to secure ourselves economically and technologically, kind of transform, treating the whole earth as sort of a pool of resources for us to use and abuse in any way that we want, because all meaning is with us, and the earth is just kind of a backdrop that has no value, no meaning in and of itself. And the ecological crisis can be understood as kind of the consequence of that way of thinking. Because insofar as we feel separate, insofar as we're not really separate, if we abuse and damage the earth, we're abusing and damaging ourselves, such as we're experiencing now.
I love what you said a little bit ago, where you were essentially describing sacrality as something that arises when you stop clinging to, specific things that might fill your lack, which to me seems to imply that, you have to release certain idols that stand in for your sense of the sacred in order to actually find the sacred. It's interesting.
Well, one interesting thing that happened, by the way, this is worth mentioning. There's an interesting difference between indigenous traditions, especially the ones that don't have scripts, and what happened when we got alphabetic script, especially, because it's if you think about the Torah, the Bible, the Quran, basically with script, sort of language takes on a life of its own, and then it becomes sacralized insofar as people think it's the word of God. But the irony is that in sacralizing that, in finding it in the book, it has the effect of tending to desacralize everything else. So one interesting thing here in Buddhism, although Buddhist texts are sometimes treated as sacred, they're not revealed. There's just guidebooks, like maps, road maps, to help us transform ourselves. But insofar as we're caught up religiously with these sacred texts, it does tend to overshadow this other sacrality that we're pointing to.
When you were saying that about the text and idolizing the text, it sort of reminds me of some descriptions of the history of the Vedas, as when they were written down, they were sort of crudified in a certain kind of way, and that originally the kind of living word was primary. And you even see that in in the Tantric Shaivite tradition, where the mantras, which were the word, the vibratory frequency of the absolute, were they couldn't be written down, and you wouldn't find them in the text because they had to be initiatory. They had to be transmitted in the context of initiation, and so the text, it's reflecting what you're saying. I think this idea that something it's too dense for what it's meant to symbolize when it gets put in the form of a text.
And that was very important historically for Buddhism. Buddhism was, we believe, an oral tradition for 300 plus years, right? Thus have I heard. That's how the suttas begin. And then right around the time it begins to be written down, Mahayana develops, and then the whole sensorium changes. There's much more visual, and if you look at some of the Mahayana, sutras, very elaborate visual imagery. So there's a kind of change in sensorium there as well.
All right, so we're getting towards the end of our conversation, which has been totally fascinating. But I wanted to end on this question. Actually, it came earlier in my questions here, but I think it's a great one to end on because I think it sort of wraps up nicely what we've been talking about, which is, well, it's based on a short video that I saw on your website, and that you had a presentation you did on the internal and external commitments, right? The importance of internal and external practices to manifest sustainable social change. And, you know, this insight I think is super important, obviously, because there's, on the one hand, we have, you know, the Western perspective of social justice, which tends to not be accompanied by contemplative practice. And then on the other side, you know, there's the opposite. So you say that they both need each other.
Yeah.
So can you talk a little bit about that?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, going back to what we said earlier about the emphasis on, in the Abrahamic traditions, on good versus evil. I mean, in a way, I think that's kind of the operative duality, isn't it? I mean, if we're created by God, he also wants us to live in a certain kind of way. And so that's where good versus evil comes in, going all the way back to Adam and Eve. And then we talked somewhat about the kind of issues there, the problems with that. But nonetheless, the other side of this preoccupation with good versus evil has been social justice. Mm-hmm. You know, think of the prophets. The Hebrew prophets, and you know, what they were saying to the kings, that they can't just do what they want, that in a way God expects them to act in a certain kind of way. They shouldn't be oppressing the orphans and the widows and the poor and so forth, that they have the same responsibility to act justly. And I think that has led to our concern for social justice, and also bringing in the Greek idea that we can transform our society if we don't like the way it's structured. Putting those together has created the modern world. And although a lot of us feel some discomfort that, you know, there's all kinds of problems, nonetheless, we also need to realize just how much has been achieved in a mere blink of history in terms of a couple hundred years. You know, overthrowing kings, Reformation, religious freedom, anti-slavery, civil rights, women's rights, gay rights, etc., etc. I mean, a lot has been achieved, I think. Mm-hmm. It's interesting, in the Buddhist tradition, there's not that concern for social justice. As we said, the primary concern is not good versus evil, but delusion versus wisdom. But it all comes back to dukkha. And when I go back and look at the earliest teachings, it seems to me that the Buddha was much more socially progressive than the institution that developed after he died. I mean, if you look at his attitude toward women, he started, you know, in his time, the situation of women in India was really bad. They were kind of chattel. But he started a women's sangha, and he emphasized, you know, so that women can awaken too. And he understood the relationship between husband and wife. They have responsibilities to each other, and so forth. And likewise, the Buddha's attitude toward caste, the way that when you entered the sangha, you lost all caste. You weren't even supposed to talk about caste. You know, really important stuff, because they're mendicants. These monks, that means they have to go begging for their food every morning, and you can't discriminate. Caste, the most important thing almost, is who prepares your food, who do you eat with. And it doesn't matter if you're a Brahmin, you enter the Sangha, you're going to go to an untouchable and beg for food. And so, you know, there was a real kind of revolutionary side there that I think that Buddhism tended to lose, because in order to survive and thrive in a non-democratic situation, you had to come to some kind of compromise or understanding with kings. And unfortunately, I think what happened was the karma teaching tended to be used to sort of rationalize the power of kings, even if they were nasty, even if they were doing all kinds of things that caused a lot of dukkha. Nonetheless, if they were born as princes, they must have really good karma from their past lifetimes, and we should obey them, and so forth and so on. So I think that's the way. It was a kind of radical beginning that somehow got lost, and it stayed lost. And the good side of that is because Buddhism emphasized personal transformation, personal dukkha. I mean, it developed this wonderful collection of contemplative practices, by far the greatest in the world. I'm pretty sure of that. But it was very much on the individual level. And then now in the West, well, in the modern era, we've lost the contemplative, with the Reformation, but we have the social justice. So it really seems to me that there are these two sides that need each other.
Yeah.
If we're going to be as successful. I guess I would call these two kind of projects, and I think we need both of them. It's like talking about two sides of freedom. We need the kind of freedom that the West has developed, democracy and so forth, but we also need the kind of freedom that Buddhism and other spiritual traditions talk about. Freedom from our own ways of thinking, from our own concepts, from our own delusions, from our own sense of separate self. I think both of these freedoms, we really need them today.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a beautiful note to end on. So do you have any closing thoughts, David, that you'd like to share based on anything that we talked about?
Well, maybe I should just mention that my recent project is, well, in addition to that Ecodharma book you mentioned, we just started this new Ecodharma Center just like a year and a half ago, not too far away from Boulder here in Colorado. Mm-hmm. And so, I think this is a really important situation. Look, ecologically, we're in very dangerous situation, as I think you know, and as most listeners will know, and we really need all the help we can get. And so for me, a real growing tip, not only for Buddhism, but all religious traditions, is what do they have to say? What do they have to offer that can help us understand and respond to our worsening ecological situation? And that's certainly one of the main focuses for our center. And so I would invite people to reflect on that and maybe come visit us sometime.
Yeah. So how can people check out the center? Is there a website?
Well, they can get there through my website, davidloy.org, but also they can go just directly Rocky Mountain Ecodharma Retreat Center.org. And I know that's a mouthful, so it's RMERC.org will also get you there.
Oh, nice.
We have a Facebook page as well.
Excellent. I'll put that in the show notes for sure. Do you have can sort of anyone show up, or is it sort of you have ongoing different programs that like weekly programs or stuff like that?
Good point. You better not just show up, because actually we're a fairly small place. What we basically do is we're sort of an umbrella, and then different groups can come and rent the facility very cheaply. That's another big concern of ours. So please don't show up, because you may not be able to get in, but check out the courses and the retreats that are being offered. And if you're interested in some of those, then please contact the appropriate people.
Excellent. Yeah, we don't want random pilgrims showing up on your doorstep.
Well, it's a little. It could be problematical, right?
Yeah. So, David, on that note of sharing projects, is there anything else? Any workshops or any programs that are coming up that you want to share with the listeners?
Well, maybe they should look at my website. Most of what I'm doing is on this. There's a page about schedule, and I try to keep that updated. I am going to be co-teaching a 2-week Ecodharma retreat next August. July and August. So that's one possibility. But if people want to follow up, they can do that. And there's also an email address on the website. So if people have more specific questions, I'll see what I can do.
I can reach out. All right, David. Well, it's been such a pleasure chatting with you.
Thank you, Jacob. I've really enjoyed it too.
Absolutely.